works. Just in terms of what we're going to cover today, I'm going to touch on business planning and marketing. Becky will look at business structures, and Suzanne, financial budgeting and tax planning. Like I say, there'll be a Q&A at the end, but if you've got a burning question, drop us a note on chat, just unmute yourself and let's have a quick question as we go through, because it's probably most relevant to cover any topics as we're discussing them. So, diversification. Coming from a farming family and working with a lot of farming diversification businesses, often the diversification idea may happen during a Sunday lunch with the family. Everybody getting quite excited in terms of what we could do with the business, where we could take it forward, what ideas we've got, or even if the other end, the business is struggling and currently you can't continue in the way that you have been, and you need to think of a new idea, a new way of introducing revenue to the business. So it starts all smiles, laughs, and everybody's full of energy and up for going for it. The following Monday morning, usually the sun, but it doesn't have to be the sun, is there knocking down walls of their old shippen or barn building, ready for that farm shop, farm cafe, diversification project. Let's get going. We know what we need to do. But quite often that's where majority of businesses fail, because they've all overexcited about the idea, they've rushed straight into it, and they haven't done any planning. And if there's one thing everybody could take away from today, is planning is key. I can't emphasize it enough. It may not be sexy, it may be quite boring and sat around the table putting budgets together, but if you do it right, you take the time to do the planning, you'll reap the rewards later on. So how I would look at it, once you've got that gem of an idea, the first thing that you need to do is research. Research, and more research. And if you're needing funding, I'm sure the bank managers we got on the call, the consultants we got on the call, then commit it to paper and start to put together that all-important business plan. This is before you've even taken that sledgehammer out of the tool shed and started knocking down the walls. Make sure that you have got a robust business plan. And again, Becky and Suzanne will touch on that when they discuss their areas. I'd like to just share with you an example of why research is so important. Some people may maybe be familiar with this image that I've got on here. It's Gloucester Services. I was very lucky enough to speak to Jane Lane, who was the daughter of the farmer that set up the first farm shop services up in Tebay. She spoke at our Cultivate conference last year. And she really gave me quite a lot of insight into how that business started. They had a family farming business up in Tebay and Penrith, and the M6 was going to come straight through their farm and completely change life as they knew it. So her dad seemed quite entrepreneurial and started looking at other ideas in terms of what they could do with the farm and how they could sort of make a living. And he had this idea to set up a roadside services. He was told many times that it wouldn't be feasible for them to run it up there because there wasn't the traffic that far north that would make it commercially viable. So Jane told me that most of her childhood was spent at service station car parks, counting the number of cars that came into the car park and then counting how many of those people went in and either purchased something, whether it's a coffee, a cake, or just simply went to the toilet. And that sort of really hit home that if you are going to be successful, you really need to do your research, crunch the numbers before you you start off. And this business has had incredible success since opening. They've got service stations up in Scotland, as well as T-Bay, and down in Gloucester. So one thing I just want to leave you with, for those of you keen readers, you may have read a book called Good to Great from a guy called Jim Collins. If you haven't, look him up. Definitely listen to the audiobook if you have time. And he sort of speaks about 3 core areas before you start any business, whether we're talking about diversification or not. One, it's got to be something that you are deeply passionate about. The other thing, the numbers have got to stack up. It's got to have a strong economic engine in terms of to be profitable. And then 3, you have got to try and be best in class at what you do. You've got to try and be world best. And just to give you an example personally, I've got over 10 years marketing experience. I am deeply passionate about helping rural businesses. And part of the reason I wanted to set up Hills Green was to combine those 2 passions, my passion for marketing and my passion for agriculture. On the family dairy farm, we could have diversified into glamping or a farm shop because it has that opportunity, but it's something that me nor my sisters are passionate about. And I would really make sure that when you are diversifying, there's loads of ideas on the table, but it may stack up economically and look like a very profitable business, but if it's you that's going to be running it, you have to be passionate about it. Yeah, that's something that you must really take on board when you're doing your business plan. So on that note, once you've done your research, you've put your business plan together, then it's all really important to think about your new business and how that's going to be structured. So I will just hand over to Becky, who will take you through this section.
Thanks, Andy. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the technology to work with me, and I'll share my screen. Aha, can you see that? Great, thank you. Oh blimey, hold on, try again. No, we've started at the end. That's always a good start. There we go. There's the beginning. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk to you today about business structures and property considerations. Possibly not the most sexy of topics, but bear with me, because as Andy said, planning is key, and these are some of the key things that you need to be thinking about. Even if you've already, you've been doing your diversified enterprise for a few years, these questions are always going to be relevant to keep reconsidering. So, as I think is often the case, a lot of diversified agricultural enterprises start running under the same header as the traditional farming operation, be that a partnership or a company. And you may be considering, well, do we even need a separate business for the diversified enterprise? It not always is the simple answer, but it will always depend on the circumstances. And these are the key things that we think you ought to be considering. One of the most important factors is managing risk. Now, farming operations are traditionally quite asset rich, be that your stock or your machinery or your land. And if you're launching a new enterprise that is opening up, say, a part of the farm to the public, or taking investment, or taking borrowing that is in a new area, then there's obviously risk associated with that. And so it might be sensible to ring fence the exposure that the new business is having away from the traditional farming operation. Another important consideration is, who are the people involved? Now, as we will all know from our experiences with various farming families, it's not always the same people making the decisions, depending on which part of the business you're in. So it may be that the key people coming in to run the diversified part of the business, or the new diversified business, want that autonomy and want to be able to make a decision without having to run it past granddad, or without having to run it past their brother-in-law. So giving that autonomy, a really good way of sort of marking that out is to open a separate business for the diversified enterprise. Now, I came up with trying to come up with an example to try and think of an easy way for me to communicate this to you, because as I say, it's not the most interesting of topics. And the example I came up with was a couple of characters called Boris and Donald, both of whom have had quite public political careers, but after recent bouts of ill health have decided they've had enough, and they're going to diversify. They're going to come back to the family farm and open a new business. Now, Boris has got a real thing for dogs. So they think doggy daycare, that's what they're going to do. They know loads of people who got dogs during furlough. They've got nowhere to take them now. They're all back at work. So they're going to open doggy daycare on the farm. So in this case, if mum and dad are farming, they're milking cows every day, Boris and Donald, quite big personalities, don't want to be running past everything past them. So in that case, it's really important to them that they have this separate business to make sure they've got the autonomy and they can run things how they want to. So once you've decided that you need a separate business, the next question is what options are available to you. Now, you may be familiar with some of these. The three main sort of key obvious options are a partnership, limited company, or a limited liability partnership. There are others, but I think these are the ones we see most commonly, particularly amongst those who were traditionally involved in the agricultural sector. So I'll just briefly take you through each. So a partnership is very basic, very simple really. A partnership, all that is required is that two people need to decide to carry on a business in common with a view to generating a profit. So in our case, Boris and Donald decide they're going to set up this doggy daycare facility. They come up with their name, Wolfpack & Co. They're in business, they take on a client, and that's it. They're in partnership. That's all that they need to do. Decide they're going to do it and do it. So obviously, a key advantage there is that it's very quick, very easy to set up. Once you've just made the decision, you're in. There's also very little reporting requirements. You don't need to register at Companies House or at any other central registry, and you don't need to report your accounts position. And Suzanne will come on to this in more detail, I'm sure, but there can be tax benefits as well, in that profits accrue directly to the partners, and that's then taxed on them personally because there's no separate legal entity. But that lack of separate legal entity can be one of the huge disadvantages as well. So partnerships don't themselves have a legal personality. They only exist through the decisions that are made by the individuals running them. So that means that all the partners involved are responsible for the debts and the liabilities of the partnership personally. So say in our example, Donald goes off and agrees some ridiculous contract with somebody who's going to come in and do poodle haircuts or something within the doggy daycare, and Boris isn't very happy about it and the cost it's going to incur. As long as Donald didn't go completely outside the remit of what the partnership agreed to do, then Boris is stuck with it. So there can be some tension there. And this brings me on to my final point regarding partnerships, which is the importance of a partnership agreement. The legislation that governs partnerships is dated 1890, the Partnership Act. It's extremely old and it's not always fit for purpose. For example, there's a standard provision in there that all partners can share equally in profits and losses. And if you've got different people putting in different contributions at the outset, that's not always going to be appropriate. So partnership agreement is really important. It should record everybody's sort of capital injections or what the proposal is, how decisions are going to be made, how profits and losses will be distributed, and who's got responsibility for what within the business. That's really important. It's also worth considering at that point, and this is a bit counterintuitive, but you need to have an eye to, okay, if this doesn't work out and we decide we're not going to carry on, what's going to happen if you want to dissolve that partnership? What we normally recommend is some sort of time scale for a partner who wants to opt out of the business to be paid off. And again, what's appropriate is going to depend upon who brought what to the table in the first place. So in our case, if Donald, being extremely wealthy, contributed significantly more than Boris did, then, can the business afford to pay him out? Question. What sort of timescale is going to be appropriate? But then you've got to think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if the flip happens, the same timescale will apply. Can the business afford to raise that finance, etc.? So these are all really key considerations. And then if you do have a partnership agreement, keep it under review. The number of partnership agreements we see that were put in place in the 60s by the grandparents that have just not been looked at since and no longer really worked for what the business is doing you'd be surprised. So that really is quite important as well. So next option is a limited company. Now, again, this will be a structure that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Key feature really is that it's a separate legal entity. It's a separate person, it exists of its own accord, completely distinct from the individuals who established it. You can have a distinction in a limited company between the people who own it, the members or shareholders, and those who control it, who are typically the directors. Often with relatively small companies, there is a commonality there. You will see that shareholders are also directors, but it doesn't have to be the case. And if you've got some investment coming in from an external third party, or you want somebody who wants to sort of be involved but not involved in decisions, then they may opt to be a shareholder but not a director. The biggest key advantage with a limited company is that you have something called a veil of incorporation, which sounds extremely mysterious, but is actually, all that means is that the company itself has legal responsibility for everything that the company does. There are some exceptions when that can be pierced, if you allow the metaphor, but generally the company can enter into its own contracts, it can take own property, it can take finance, it operates entirely separately from the individuals who are running it. So you don't have your personal assets on the line like you might in the case of a partnership. If something goes wrong, the individual partners are exposed. If something goes wrong in a company, usually it stays ring-fenced within the company. So the liability is limited. A real good benefit of the company is that there's also a lot of transparency. So because they've got more extensive filing requirements than partnerships, third-party investors or those wanting to enter into contracts with the company can go on Companies House and can see who's involved, what its financial position is, etc. Now, in our case, Donald, secret man that he is, isn't really a fan of that, isn't really one for transparency, so would much rather keep his affairs private. But if that isn't a huge consideration for you, then that might be the right approach. So flip side, disadvantages. The veil of incorporation that I mentioned a few minutes ago is permeable. It can be pierced in certain circumstances. Usually that's wrongful trading or a breach of directors' duties. Directors have quite extensive obligations as companies, and we often see people taking on a directorship without really appreciating quite how extensive those obligations are. So it's really worth looking that up and getting to grips with what you're expected to do. So there's all sorts of things, sort of you owe a responsibility to the company to act in a particular way. You owe a responsibility to customers and creditors not to continue to trade if you are aware the company is insolvent, and so on and so forth. And if directors behave in a way outside those duties, then there are circumstances in which they can become personally responsible for the company's liabilities, even though it's got this veil of incorporation. There's also far more extensive filing and reporting requirements, which is often seen as a disadvantage. Obviously, Companies House want to hear every year who's in control, and they want to see accounts every year as well. Again, shareholders agreement is really important with a company. A company's constitution is its articles, and they are generally a public document that's lodged at Companies House. But a shareholders agreement is the agreement between the owners of the company, which stays private. And again, it provides for how key decisions are to be made, what will happen if there's a deadlock and an agreement can't be reached, and how shares will be paid out or dealt with if a shareholder wishes to leave or passes away or something of that nature. So again, as with the partnership agreement, it's really important to consider payment out terms and valuation in the event that agreement can't be reached. And then finally, limited liability partnerships. Now, these are a bit of a hybrid. They tend to be used for professional firms like solicitors firms and accountants firms, but they are available to any business. So they have some of the advantages of a company in that there's limited liability, but they do have far more limited reporting requirements. So your members agreement, your partnership agreement in this case stays completely private, doesn't have to be filed at Companies House. And so there can be more flexibility and a bit more privacy if that's what you think is necessary for your business. You do still have to file annual accounts, but as I say, it's not quite as extensive as in the case of a limited company. And they have a separate legal entity distinct from the partners, as a company does. So can enter into contracts, can borrow, can raise finance in the same way as a limited company. Again, partnership agreement is really key for the same reasons as I've mentioned before. Now, in our example, Boris and Donald decide that actually on reflection, that's where they want to be. They want to be an LLP. So they incorporate themselves as Wolfpack LLP to enter their doggy daycare business. So far, so good. Next question, property. What do they need to run this business? Now, again, it's going to depend on what you're diversifying into. You know, if you're running a marketing business like Andy, you don't necessarily need any space other than a spot at the kitchen table initially, and then perhaps some offices when things start to pick up, which you can get anywhere off farm. But in my example, Boris and Donald, they've got their eye on a redundant farm building that's had nothing done to it for a few years. And they also think that because they're going to want to walk the dogs, they're probably going to need a bit of land every day, not necessarily the same land every day, but a bit of a field in order to allow the dogs to exercise. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, how is that land owned? Where is it? Who owns it? Is it part of the traditional farming partnership? Is it owned individually by certain partners outside the partnership? Or is it tenanted? Are you tenant farmers? For freehold owners, it's going to be a little bit more straightforward in that you're not as constricted as you might be if you're an Agricultural Holdings Act tenant or an FBT tenant. But if your farm is subject to an existing legal charge or mortgage to a bank, then just double check the terms of your mortgage before you go diving straight into your renovations and your change of use, because in almost every mortgage deed I've ever read, there is a provision that says you shouldn't change the use of your premises or grant any leases of your premises without your bank's consent. Now, most bank managers, and hopefully the ones on this call today, will agree that, you know, as long as there's a robust business plan, they're not going to necessarily object to any of these changes. But equally, you don't want to find yourself inadvertently in breach of your mortgage because you failed to take that step into account. Likewise with insurances, make sure, especially if you're letting the public onto your premises for the first time, that you've got appropriate insurances in place and that you've given that some consideration. In our case, Boris and Donald decide that Wolfpack LLP is going to take a business tenancy of the farm building and then a license of the field, so that the farming partnership can move them around to different land depending on where the need is and where they can walk the dogs. But the building they want exclusive possession of, so that is a business tenancy. Fortunately, their parents are freehold owners, so it's quite straightforward to grant this tenancy. But bear in mind, business tenancies operate in a very different regime to agricultural tenancies. Different laws apply in terms of security of tenure, so you'll need some advice just to make sure you're getting that spot on as to what needs to go in that tenancy agreement. And then for tenant farmers, it will depend a bit, your position will, on A, what your lease says, and B, whether you're an AHA tenant under an old style Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy or an FBT, farm business tenancy. Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies tend to be a bit more restricted, a bit more tied in terms of what you can and can't do. However, we're finding more and more what we're seeing coming into our office is that landlords are taking quite a flexible approach to diversification. They're conscious that, you know, not most, but a heck of a lot of agricultural businesses these days are having to diversify in order to maintain their income. And so from a landlord's point of view, any change of use may well have a beneficial impact for them on rent review. So they may well be open-minded to changing the use and to allowing you to expand beyond the traditional farming operation. So it's a question of having the conversation in most cases. You may need to agree a formal amendment to your documentation that you've currently got in place, but the first place is to open up that dialogue with either your landlord or your agent in order to get the conversation started. And that is basically everything I wanted to cover. I've just noticed some key contacts there. They're my colleagues at Gabbrook Park. We've got an agricultural team, company and commercial team, specialise in all the things I've discussed today. I think Andy will circulate these around after the event, but that is everything I wanted to say. So unless anyone's got any questions, I will pass the mic.
Thank you very much, Becky. I can't see anybody shouting out at the minute, but if not, we can cover those questions at the end.
Right, I'll stop sharing then, Andy, thanks.
Thanks, Becky, and we'll pass the baton over to Suzanne at Brightshire.
Thank you, Andy. Right, this is the bit where I've learnt today, so this could go horribly wrong. So we'll have a go at how I do this. Oh, what have I done? Oh no, how do I get to it? Come on, I'll have to have some help, back office help here. How do I get back onto that screen?
I assure you, she may not be great with technology, but she's absolutely brilliant when it comes to figures.
Thank you. Right, there you go. That's why today I stayed in the office, because I knew I'd need Amy's help. I've obviously, as I explained, have been doing sets of accounts, particular for farmers for 20 plus years. And diversification now, there's a lot more of it in sets of accounts that I see. The NFU did about a survey recently, and they said at least 48% of farmers have diversified. And that's mainly as a result in changing times. We've got subsidies reducing. We've got extreme weather conditions. You know, we've had droughts, we've had torrential rain. It's difficult sometimes to just support families of farming income. So diversification has become quite key to improve profits. Also, when you've got next generations coming in and there's more people drawing from the same pot, they have different ideas of where they want to go, what they want to do. And that again is reflected in diversification. So what I want to just go through with you is some of the things that I have seen in sets of accounts. Some of the risks a little bit associated, so picking up from what Rebecca was talking about and how they could be structured. And then I want to go on to sort of budgeting, financials, and then tax. So some of the areas that I tend to see in accounts that over the last few years, there's the farming and going down the line of the farming, such as processing, as Karen talked about, going to cheeses, ice creams. So there's that line that just lends itself to the farm. But there's also passive income streams. There's a massive move now towards more storage. A lot of clients are starting to look at caravan storage. You know, as we've had a move towards staycations, you know, people are going and buying motorhomes, caravans. Drives don't lend themselves to more than 1 or 2 cars, so they are needing somewhere for those to go. So there's been quite a move towards storage. Not so much offices in recent times, although there was a big move in them about 10 years ago. Again, location is very key with offices. It's no good having an office and you can't get Wi-Fi in this day and age, or we won't be able to do this, would we? So that's quite key as well. But obviously with COVID now, we could see quite a change in how people operate. A lot more are working from home now. So it'll be interesting to see what the office market does. And I think small offices probably still have their place. Whether the large offices now will change how they operate. I can't see many people going back to the office in the way that they were beforehand. Wind turbines, solar panels, biomass, AD plants, they've been obviously quite key as well, especially when the feed-in renewal heat incentive was quite high. Still think there's a place for those in farms. And as Becky said, there is an element where you need to think about protection of your existing assets. I've advised quite a few clients who have done big projects on how they should be structured. And we've looked into mainly putting those sorts of assets through limited companies, especially if they already have farm that trades through a limited company. So for example, a broiler unit with a big biomass attached to it. They might set up more of a group entity where the broiler unit will run in one company, but it will have a fellow subsidiary, for example, that would operate the biomass, to add that element of protection, but to allow some interaction between the businesses without any tax consequences. And then we move to liveries. You do tend to find you might have a farm that has a few redundant buildings that starts to offer some stables and a little bit of horse livery. Again, that tends to be run within the existing partnership because it's not generally a significant income. But as that may build up and livery becomes bigger, it's something that needs to be thought through as to how that should sit there. And then we get into the glamping, B&Bs, holiday lets, camping. Again, that's quite key at the moment with staycations again, and the UK tourism really improving, obviously, with the back of COVID. I want to talk in a bit more detail about the tax implications, in particular in holiday lets, as I go through my slides. So there's some of the things I've seen over the last sort of 20 years of my career to date. So budgeting. This is obviously key for a woman because it's a plan on how to spend money. So obviously we women like those things. But what it obviously is, the intentions of it is to do, and in particular forecasting, is to make sure you know what it is that you are going to be doing and how much that is going to cost. So if, for example, you are going to convert some barns to holiday lets or set up a glamping site, you need to know how much that is going to cost you. You need to get quotes, figures, so that you know how much you need in terms of infrastructure and spend. So you can go to your bank and you can say, look, this is what I will need. I need a bit of headroom in this. And you're prepared for every eventuality. You then need to ensure that your business forecasts and your business plan are robust as well. If you are going to set a holiday let up, for example, and by the time you've spent the money, when is it going to be active? It's going to fall into the wrong time of year. So you're missing all the summer season, your spring, and you're going to launch it in November. You may find that although you'll get obviously people coming for Christmas, you might get people coming in the February half term, you're not going to get perhaps as much income stream in the back end of the year as you will in the peak season of August, for example. So you need to bear in mind that is going to have some costs associated to it, especially if you're going to have employed labour as well to assist. So your financial forecasts need to take into mind the cost of keeping something open with perhaps very little return coming in. And you need to obviously make sure in your lending and in your, I suppose, overdraft facility, you've got backup for if it doesn't start. So one example I can show is a holiday let where you're going to convert some barns. You want top notch, you're going out for luxury holiday lets. You're reliant on builders and contractors to come in. You're trying to do some of it yourself as well to keep costs down. You don't get that build signed off and ready to let for 18 months, 2 years. You've then got to build up a business, so you'll want to be engaging the services of Andy to do so, because it's a whole new field and you're going to need to get people in. So that's going to take a bit of time to build up. So you could be looking at 3.5 years before you've got a business, and then it generally can take 12 months for that to become a viable business. So you could be 4 or 5 years down the line and not have actually made sufficient profit to be repaying the debt that you've lent the money for. And all surprise, surprise, you're coming to the end of your 5-year fixed term and you've not got robust enough accounts to show to your bank manager to go forward. And this does happen, unfortunately. And that's because perhaps the clients didn't look at their budget, didn't take advice of relevant professionals to know that actually they weren't ever going to be able to make it viable by the 5-year time. And they didn't look at what the consequences of that would be. And then you're into going and agreeing a different deal with the bank to be able to carry on. So it is really important to get your financials right. The other element I want to just mention is what they call overtrading. And this can affect all businesses. And I have seen it in farms as well with diversification. So you start off with one office, do really well, gets a lot more demand. You decide I'm going to create a lot more. I'm going to go for this. And what they call it is overtrading. So it's where you've expanded, you take on more staff. So a farm shop, you take on more staff, you're really growing, you open a cafe, everything's going well, but you haven't got the lending in place to support that growth. And what happens then is when things get tight and trade could drop off, we go in lockdown, for example, again, trade could drop off, you haven't got sufficient funds to be able to cover you over that period. And the expansion hasn't been planned, hasn't been budgeted for, you've not discussed it with the bank, and suddenly you haven't got the resource there to keep that business going. And unfortunately, overtrading can mean a loss of the business. And again, if you're operating as a partnership, as Becky said, it also runs the risk of affecting your other assets that you own personally as well. So it is important to consider you get your budgets right and your financial forecasts and elements of seasonality and variances in those to see really that you've got all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. I always get that wrong, so that's one good thing. Right, so taxes. Now this is a massive subject and Andy only gave me 20 minutes and I love to talk. So this is really difficult for me. So I thought, well, I need to tailor it because I could talk to you on every one of those diversifications in great detail and would be here by the end of year. So I'm picking holiday lets in particular because of the fact that we've now, and most people are holidaying in the UK. So, there may be more people thinking, well, actually we could, that farm workers cottage that's now sort of redundant, we could use that, we could convert some barns, let's tap into this market of staycations. So when you're looking at diversification, you do need to think about all various sorts of taxes. VAT can be impacted, inheritance tax, capital gains tax and income tax. So holiday lets and they're quite an interesting one for the tax legislation because for income tax, they do have an element of a trade. They did remove the sideways loss relief. So you could make losses in a holiday let and offset it against your other income. You no longer can do that. So if you make a loss in your holiday let because it hasn't got up and running and you've got costs associated with it, that loss has to be offset against the next future profits now. But there isn't any interest restriction on holiday lets as there is with buy-to-lets. So if you've got a mortgage and you've got interest, all that interest can be offset against a holiday let income, where for private residences and buy-to-lets, it's offset, it's restricted on the amount that you can offset now. For VAT, it is also considered to be a standard rate supply. So if you are going above the VAT threshold of 85,000, you do have to VAT register yourself for VAT. So again, that's something that you need to think about at the time that you're going to do it. If you're going to bring it into your main farming business, you're automatically going to have to charge people VAT on the holidays, because your farm tends to be a VAT registered business. So if it comes into the balance sheet and the income's going to come in, you'll have to apply VAT straight away on it. At the moment, we've obviously got a 5%, but that will stop in January 2021. So that's one thing. So do you want to pull it out and have it in a different structure in order not to VAT register, because you don't want to make yourself more expensive in the marketplace? But if you don't choose to VAT register and you're going to run it in a different partnership, and that has to include different partners to the farm, you need to be mindful that it has got this level of 85,000, but also it's going to restrict the VAT that you can claim back. So if you are going to do quite a lot of work on a property, you may end up having to forgo that VAT element as well. The other thing with holiday lets, which a lot of clients may use them for, is if they've got rollover money, you can roll over into a holiday let, as long as it meets the criteria of being available for let for 210 days and let for 105. That's so sad that I know that, sorry. You can roll over into them. So if you've got land that's going for sale, again, it might be an option for you. They also are available for entrepreneurs relief. So if you decided to pack in a holiday let business, you could get the entrepreneurs relief as well, which obviously is at the moment capped at £1 million. But they do come under that. However, and that's where it all goes a bit downhill, they don't qualify as a business generally for inheritance tax purposes. So we've had quite a few cases go through the courts, the last one being the case of Ross. And it's really about the quantity of activity you do. And in the case of Ross, they'd got a lot of holiday lets. They've got about 8 holiday lets. They've got some other properties within the partnership. And they'd aligned themselves with a local hotel in Cornwall that was offering services from them, and they agreed that they'd pay them a percentage of their income, 14% of their income, to provide all these services. So they did like all the reception duties, you know, they'd book taxis, you could put your luggage in there. They'd go and obviously do all the laundry. They'd provide food, so they'd take food over to the holiday let complex. All these services were provided, and yet HMRC still did not consider them to be a business. I think because there's been quite a few cases going through the courts now, I think that they're just taking the view that holiday lets are not going to get relief. So I think the more activity you do, the more you put on your website that you do all these, the better the chances of argument with them. But I think they're just, everyone that goes through now, they're going to basically say, no, it's passive income, it's passive income. And you've got to have a really strong argument to change that, which is why you might put your holiday let within your partnership, your farming partnership, because you may be able to get it as part of the ancillary activities of the farm. So, for example, a case that went through the courts, and I've done it with a lot of clients as well. Lord Balfour, which you might have all heard to death now, but he'd got a big landed estate, a lot of let properties, a lot of let farms, in-house as well. But they were able to get business property relief on everything because he treated it as one trade. His level of activity was coming from the farm as well. His actual value of his estate was was quite significantly investment, but they were able to get business property because of this whole one business treatment. And so if you've got a farm and you've got a certain level of income, and what they tend to say is the legislation at them currently has a 51% trade to a 49% investment. That will definitely, I think, change. The Tax Simplification Office are looking at more of an 80-20 split, which is exactly the same as what they use for capital gains tax purposes when you're looking at investment on balance sheets. So I think, one, if you've got quite a lot of investment on your balance sheet, it's time to be looking at it and thinking whether you should take some of it off. But equally, if you are thinking of diversifying, you've got to consider, well, actually, if I go down the route of a holiday let, will 20% of that income be less than 20% of my total turnover? Will it contribute to 20% of the net profit? And will its gross asset value be 20% of the gross asset and the farm being 80? You haven't got to meet all three criteria, but you've certainly got to show that it is ancillary to the trade. And if you can do that, then having an element of diversification, which would not otherwise get relief, is a good thing to do. So that's really the points on holiday lets. The same sort of treatment applies to livery. However, livery is an exempt supply for VAT purposes if you are doing DIY livery. And that can create an absolute nightmare if you've also running that through a partnership with standard supplies as well. You're into partial exemption rules whenever you run something that's exempt through a standard rated business. I can't get into that today. It's the most complex legislation going. But if anybody is interested to know about that, then and can't get to sleep at night, then please contact me. So there's things like that. If you are running a business such as processing ice creams, you're going down that, then you and a commercial shoot, for example, they would come under business property relief. So if you've got that structured correctly in one of the entities Becky was talking about before, it wouldn't matter necessarily that it's not part of your farming entity. And I think you have to look at the risks associated as well. Don't always let the tax determine everything. So yeah, I could go on and on and on, but I've been told by my colleague I'm already overrunning, so I better call time on it. So Andy, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Just before we move on, has anybody got any questions in relation to what Suzanne was just discussing there that you want to raise? Not at the minute. Okay, cool. Well, we can go over more questions at the end. Right, the final bit. Okay, so hopefully you can see the screen now. Thumbs up would be great. Right, cool. I will now take you on to looking at marketing planning. So in this example, you've done all your research, you've done all your planning, you've done your budgeting, you've decided how you're going to set your business up, you've been knocking down those walls of the old barn, and you've put this lovely farm shop together. But one thing you might notice, you haven't got any customers. And this is not unheard of. What I find with the majority of farm diversification businesses, because traditionally in farming, you've not really had to market yourselves. 9 times out of 10, you don't really know how to do it or what to do. You know, if you're a dairy farm, tanker picks it up and you get your milk check once a month. Sheep, beef, you take your animals to market and all being well, you get paid. But we've never really had to market and sell what we do as a business. And obviously it is very important, or else you will not hit your targets set by your business plan. So we've got a very simple sort of marketing planning template that we take a lot of our clients through, whether it's a completely new business or an existing business coming to us looking for growth. The first place to start is, what is the goal? What is the target that you're looking to achieve from your marketing? Because if you're not clear on that, how can you measure the success of your marketing and how it's performed? And with the goal or target, get really specific. I think the best answer I had when I was running a workshop of one of these was the desired result being to gain brand awareness. Well, I said, it may be great if you gain brand awareness, but if you don't gain any customers, I don't think you'd be in business for too long. So when you're thinking about the desired result, think about, is it how many customers are we looking to win in the next 3 or 6 months? If it's more like a B2B business, how many prospects are we going to be seeing? How many proposals are we going to be writing? How many, if we look on, say, like Karen's example, if you started processing milk, how many farm shops are we going to be speaking to in order to get our milk into that farm shop? So get really clear on what it is. And once you've done that, even if it's a completely new business, you can do a quick back of the fag packet calculation in terms of what that's worth to your business, in terms of the turnover and profit during that time. And once you know those figures, so say, for example, you're looking that the activity would generate £10,000 profit, for example. Well, all of a sudden, spending £1,000 on marketing isn't such a massive expense, because you are looking that it's going to generate you £10,000 in profit if you get it right. However, if I just turned around and said, well, you need to be looking at least £1,000 to get this off the ground, because you're all farmers and and tight, you tell me where to go. But if I told you it was going to make you 10 grand, then you might be a bit more, listen to it a little bit more carefully. And then the next thing is just sense checking that objective in terms of what the consequences are of achieving that. So do you have the business staffed well enough to actually cope with that level of demand? Do you need to think more about the operational side of the business before you put your foot on the gas to really grow? The next most important thing is the target market. And quite often in new businesses, you're happy to take anybody. As long as they're paying and we're getting money in the till, we will literally take anybody. However, it's not a good strategy and won't last very long. You really need to get quite specific in who you're trying to target. So take, for example, Suzanne's case study in terms of holiday lets. Think about what's the typical customer that we want to be attracting for this business. I've put here, a young family with primary age children, a reasonable amount of disposable income, families that like to be outdoors and perhaps willing to travel up to 3 hours. Now you can argue that I've gone very specific with that, and it doesn't mean that the couple in the 60s with a dog that wants to get away for a few nights aren't going to become customers. But it does mean that when we are marketing your business, we're thinking about that core audience in mind and talking to them as if I was talking to them now. Then you need to think about who you are. And I liken this to meeting up with an old friend in the pub. Hopefully we can still continue to do that in the north come next week. But say you're meeting up an old friend and you're telling them about your diversification project. and what you're up to at the minute. Are you really clear as one of the owners or managers or leaders of that new enterprise in terms of what that business is? Now, it may sound really daft, but most people do know what their business is. They also know how they do what they do, but not everybody knows why they do what they do. And a guy called Simon Sinek is well, I'm a great fan of his. And if you get 5 minutes, you should Google the power of why. And he talks about the importance of being really clear personally about what your why is, why you get up in the morning, and why you really feel passionate about that business. Because unless you're clear on that why, then the people that you're employing, the team that you're working with, won't be clear on that why. And then when they're having drinks with their mates in the pub and they ask you, what's that business that you're part of? They won't be communicating about that why well enough. So whatever area of diversification you're going into, it's a crowded market, and you really need to be clear on what your why is and what sets you apart from your competition. And as well as that, you will then start having these sort of key unique selling points that you can be pushing within your marketing to make you stand out in the crowd. And finally, what's your story? So I think majority of farm diversification projects are family-run businesses, and everybody loves a good story. And if you can really help or use your marketing to help tell that story and effectively build an emotional connection with a consumer, then the more likely you are to win the business. So you're clear on the goal, you're clear on who you're trying to target, you're clear on your why and why you do what you do. Then when it comes to communication, advertising, putting your name out there to try and reach that target market, you should have a good idea of how to communicate that, but also what channels to use. And this slide here just is a bit of a brain dump of all the areas you could look, all those touch points you could look to take advantage of to try and promote your business. And there's a bit of a saying within marketing that you hear quite often around, I'm pretty sure that 50% of my marketing is working. I'm just not sure which 50%. And it's very easy on all of these channels to just waste a lot of money. And 9 times out of 10, you're following a crowd or a trend in terms of, oh, well, I'm a new business, I need a website, I need social media, I need leaflets, I need to put adverts in the paper. But actually, do you need to do all that? And coming back to that target audience and who you're trying to reach, if you're much more strategic, you could actually spend less on marketing and make it work much harder for you. And then the final point around that is make sure that you are controlling and measuring what you're doing. So going right back to the start, where we set that goal in terms of what we want our marketing to do, there is no point in doing any of that work unless we're measuring how it's performing. So if it's number of new customers, have we got a simple spreadsheet, or is it through the till that we're tracking the number of customers that we're serving? Number of prospects, number of proposals. You can use fancy CRM systems or you can use a spreadsheet, but make sure and get in the habit early on to track your performance, because if it isn't working, you need to rerun that marketing planning tool to see what needs to change. And if it is working, not all aspects of the marketing will be working. So it might be that you've tried one channel, but for whatever reason, it just isn't performing, but another channel is working much better. So let's divert some budget from the channel that isn't working to the channel that is. And all of a sudden, your business will start to grow. I've just gone through a session that would usually take half a day in probably 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm very conscious that equally the content that Suzanne and Becky have gone through, there is a lot to take in. And by all means, we did not set this webinar up to put anybody off diversification. But we do want to help businesses make sure they get it right. And it's only through all of our experience personally or with our clients, we've seen the pitfalls and areas where if they'd done it differently, their business would become a success or would be more successful than it is currently. So please take all the content that we've gone through today with the right frame of mind and the positive frame of mind. We really want to champion and promote diversification, but just don't be too hasty in terms of jumping into it and knocking down those walls the day after you've had the idea. Take a step back, think about whether it's right for you, your family and your business, and plan. So I think that is enough of my voice on there. I'm going to stop sharing.